Again, really excited to be here this morning. Excited to be back, and also excited to go home to see my family tonight. Very excited for that too. Okay, one of the things I was asked to talk about current field realities. So, what is the mission field like today? What statistics can we take to kind of make sense of where the gospel is at? How far has the message of Jesus gone? How far does it need to go? How do we make sense of it all? So the title for this message is called The Missions World Today. And I'm going to start off by sharing some statistics, and we're going to talk a little bit about it, about what it means for us as part of the local church. So there are 7.9 billion people on the planet today. The median age is only 30 years old. Life expectancy is 67. So you have 7.9 billion people, median age 30, and the expectancy on average is 67 years. And this is where it gets tough. So we're talking about the unreached world. We're talking about unreached people groups. And there's two different ways you could break this down. Joshua Projects breaks down, they would say roughly 17,400 people groups right now. And they would say of that 17,400, 7,400 would be considered unreached. We'll get to what that word means here in a second. Wycliffe and actually Ethnos Canada would probably say, we probably break it down a little bit differently. We'd say there's about 7,300 people groups, and of that maybe around 2,500 would still be considered unreached. So people group is, again, even then, a people group is a tough thing to kind of put boundaries around. So we divide people groups up by things like language, by things like culture, sometimes even geography, tradition. There's a lot of things that go into dividing up a people group. And then in the midst of language, just talking about language, you have all these different dialects of a language. So at what point does it become a different people group? So there's a lot of questions about this. One helpful way to think about it is that we would say roughly about 1/3, a minimum, if you want a conservative estimate, we would say about 1/3 of the world, maybe around 2 billion at least, are still unreached to the gospel. So how do you define the term unreached people group? Today in missiology, you would probably say something like an unreached people group is a people group that is less than 2% evangelical Christian. So less than 2%. And usually the reason we say 2% is they lack the resources and the ministers to evangelize their own people group. So you maybe have a couple believers in that, but they lack the resources and personnel to evangelize their own people. So because this, we're sitting here, 2,000 years after Jesus Christ came, lived, and died. We're talking about the most important message in our lives. What we're saying is the knowledge of who Jesus is and access to God's word is something that is very, very significant for us. And if we recognize its personal significance, what we're also saying is it is significant for the people who don't have it yet. That's what we're saying. We're saying not just, there's people out there, 2 billion. Again, what do these numbers even mean sometimes? 2 billion at least that don't have access to the gospel. But what we would say within Christianity is it matters that they don't have access. It is a significant and saddening thing that 1/3 of the world still doesn't have access to the gospel. The state of Christianity, we would say this, there's about 2.43 billion Christians today. It's about 30% of the population. But this is the broadest level of what we would classify Christianity. So that would include anybody who would claim to be a Christian, even Catholicism, all these different sects of Christianity. The broadest level, 2.4 billion Christians in the world today, 30%. There would be 400 million evangelical Christians. So there's 400 million Christians who we can feel pretty confidently about, that they have a clear, proper understanding of the gospel. 400 million, really confident, they know who Jesus is, faith, grace alone, only way to be made right with God. of the Christian, of that higher level, there's 4.19 million full-time Christian workers. So at the broadest level, there's about 4 million Christian workers in the world today. 90% of those Christian workers work in the Christian world. So at the broadest level of Christianity, you've got 2.4 billion Christians that are being ministered to by 4 million, and then 90% of those are ministering inside of the Christian world. Of those 2.43 billion Christians in the world, there's 435,000 Christian missionaries working around the world today. And of those 435,000 Christian missionaries, 11,900 are working amongst the unreached. So that's 2.7% of Christian missionaries are working in an unreached people group. In 2001, there were 900 Christian churches for every one unreached people group. And there are 54,000 evangelical Christians for every one unreached people group today. So when we throw up numbers like 2 billion, right? Okay, it's huge. 1/3 of the world. It feels like this insurmountable task. And as soon as you get into the data, what you begin to realize is that the data is telling us the world is not beyond reach. That there is the Christian personnel and even the finances available to reach every people group on the earth. That is totally within the grasp of the personnel and the financial situation of the church today. State of Christian giving. I want to talk about this just for a minute. My goal here isn't to make any judgment statements. My goal is to say, okay, this is the stats. This is where we as Christians give our money to. So at the highest level, again, that broadest level of Christianity, Christians make about $53 trillion a year. And evangelical Christians make $6.72 trillion. Of that $53 trillion, Christians tithe 1.5% across the board, which ends up being almost a trillion. $896 billion is tithed. So the question is, what happens to that money that's tithed? What do we do with it all? Okay? $896 billion is a lot of money. What does Christianity as a whole do with the money that's tithed to the church? So 82%, $734 billion, goes towards home ministries that are occurring in the church, right? And usually that means it's in a Christian environment or a Christian nation or something like that. 12%, $107.5 billion, goes towards home evangelization. So we have home ministries, and then another $107.5 billion goes towards evangelizing the communities that these churches are a part of. $52 billion, so 6% of the money that is tithed goes towards missions. $52 billion. So Christians as a whole making $53 trillion a year. They give $896 billion, and then of that $896 billion, $52 billion goes towards missions. 1.7% of the money that goes towards missions goes towards reaching the people that don't have access to the gospel. So you've got $88 million that is given towards what we will classify as unreached people groups. So people groups that do not have a functioning church and established Christian community. 1.7% of the $52 billion that goes to missions. So for every $100,000 at the highest level, Christianity, really broad term, I get that, really broad term. At the highest levels, every $100,000 that Christians make, $1.70 goes to seeing the unreached reach the gospel. So we talk about what's the state of Christianity, what's the state of reaching the unreached. This is the reality we're talking about right now. Christian makes $100,000 a year, $1.70, maybe a small cup of coffee, goes towards reaching the unreached. So I want to pause right there. And I want to go back to the first slide that we talked about. What time am I done at again? Is it 10:45? Okay. I'll go back to that first slide that we talked about, the state of the world. Because not only we could talk about the statistics, and even though statistics are somewhat comparable, over the last 15, 20 years, there's progress being made for sure, but still a long, long way to go. So even though the statistics are somewhat comparable, the world that we are doing ministry in is fundamentally changed in 20 years and will continue to do so. How has the world changed today? When we think about missions, especially when we think about unreached people groups, right? We think about these smoldering fires, okay? And there's people, and they've never met an outsider before, and you're walking to the village for the first time or whatever. You have grass huts, no technology, really, really primitive. But this has become a fundamental misconception about the scope of the unreached. There are still unreached people groups like this, but they are now the minority. We think about unreached being like this, okay, plains, grass, right? It's all like nature. Think about men like this in Papua New Guinea, like this in Venezuela. But this is what the unreached world looks like today. So the unreached world is very remote and in some ways primitive, but that isn't the majority of the unreached world anymore. So the world that is now unreached by the gospel has a smartphone, internet access, an education probably. So we think that, okay, going to the unreached world means that I have to learn how to canoe, right? I've got to learn how to canoe and start a fire by hand. And I'm living really remote. Well, maybe it means that. Maybe one of you, goes to this really remote place, right? And eating grubs or something. But maybe you're reaching the unreached world and you go live in a city in Vietnam, like a friend of mine's doing right now. So I just wanted to stop for a second. We're going to talk about what it takes, right? We're going to talk about that. But I want to talk about what we think of when we think of the unreached person. That it is men like this, but it is also men like this. That when we talk about reaching the unreached, our goal isn't that we would all work, in primitive places. The goal in reaching the unreached is that we would be going to the places where the unreached people are. And that means now, especially cities. So let's talk about that for a second. Globalization. I'm going to read this quote. Bear with me for a second because it gets to the point. There's two main things, if I could just boil it down. There's a lot that's changed in the world. If I could boil it down really quickly, there are two core things that have fundamentally changed about the world in the last, we could say 100, 200 years maybe. It's rapidly progressing. That change is ramping up. But globalization right here, ready? Drugs, crime, sex, war, disease, people, ideas, images, news, information, entertainment, pollution, goods, and money now all travel the globe. So you have these really clear borders historically. You had really clear distinctions. If you wanted to learn something, somebody had to come to you. News had to travel. And it usually took a long time for the news to travel around the globe. That's not reality anymore. So they're crossing national boundaries and connecting the world on an unprecedented scale and with previously unimaginable speed. The lives of ordinary people everywhere in the world seem increasingly to be shaped by events, decisions, and actions that take place far away from where they live and work. Can you think of something global that just occurred recently that has radically affected the way we live? So you got a outbreak in China, right? And guess what? There's pretty much no place on the earth it didn't impact. Because we're traveling all over the place. Sea or ocean barriers, what does that mean now? If you're flying, if it's an 8-hour flight to cross it. So the world is probably smaller than it has ever been in human history. We have the capacity to travel the globe more efficiently, and we do so more frequently than ever before. Cultures, economies, and politics appear to merge across the globe through the rapid exchange of information, ideas, and knowledge, and the investment strategies of global corporations. Okay, so here's what we're saying. We talk about globalization. Functionally, the world is getting smaller. You are way more affected by realities outside of the U.S. than we have ever been. Sorry, I'm talking in Canada. You are way more affected as Canadians by things that happen outside of Canada than you've ever been before. I want to share a quote. I've got a buddy of mine. I can't share his name, but he's working in Vietnam right now. And I want to share a quote from him as he's talking about this reality. Globalization. How affected we are by things that aren't even happening in our own, territory. Is that a Canadian thing, right? Territories. Okay, yeah, there we go. Okay. I said state, but I've been told that's wrong. Okay? Province. There we go. Yeah, province. See? That's essentially what I said. Okay? All right. Here's what he has to say, okay? Think of how many of you are likely to travel overseas in your life. Probably most of you. In fact, my guess would be the minority of you haven't traveled overseas. So that's interesting. Okay, think of how many of you are likely to get a t-shirt or a tattoo with something that involves a foreign language. Think of how likely it is that you're wearing something right now made in a different nation. That's an interesting concept. I think my shirt's from H&M, and it was not made in America. It wasn't made in Canada. Think of how many of you have watched a YouTube video this week that came from outside of Canada. Think of how many people the world over will have Think of how many people the world over will have a strong reaction when they think back to early 2020 and the COVID virus. Think of how few people the world over have been shielded by that. Think of what kind of world would have to exist to make all those things possible, and you're thinking of a world where globalization is in full swing. Technology is doing this. Economies are doing this. Religions are doing this. Entertainment is doing this. This is my friend, and he's working in that city, that big photo I just showed, that city. This is where my friend is working right now, in Vietnam. Okay? You know how far away his family is? And he can talk to them in about 20 seconds. Pulls out his phone. Right? My wife recalls, she's a little bit older than me. My wife recalls being in college and having a calling card, right? And she would call Papua New Guinea. Her parents worked there. She would call Papua New Guinea, and by the time she put in like $20, she'd have like 3 minutes, right, on this calling card. So she'd punch in the numbers and she'd call, and there would be a voice saying, "You have this many seconds left." She'd be like weeping, "Oh, Mom, I miss you so much." She went to college in America. But those are the things we're talking about. That doesn't even compute to this generation that's growing up right now. Like, if you want to call somebody, you just call them. Like, you might get charged a little bit for Verizon if you're calling somewhere, but there's no like big, there's no time limit. We're talking about pay phones. Like how rapidly the world has progressed is truly incredible, even in my lifetime. Next, I want to talk about this globalization. Oh, really quick, I just share a story. I had a teacher when I was in missionary training. Worked in this really, really remote people group. Did a church plant there maybe 25, 30 years ago. And I mean, it's like plane-only access, right? Plane-only, incredibly remote, no contact really that much with the outside world. Did a church plant there. It was a functioning church in this people group in Papua New Guinea now. And he's working at Missionary Training Center, ETR, in the United States. And one day he gets a call from a number he doesn't recognize. Flips open his phone, and he hears his tribal language being spoken. It takes him a while, to compute what he's hearing. I'm not sure if he's ever heard the language spoken over a phone before. And you know what happened? Well, the people group, they did church planting in 30 years ago. They have cell phones now and cell phone access. Like, they've got towers where they can call from. And a guy in his people group, this is true, climbed up a palm tree. Top of this palm tree, whips out his phone and gives George a call. George is like, hello? This is where the world is heading. It's not done yet. It's not even close to being done. The world is so fundamentally connected. Like, okay, let me pause there for a second. Let's talk about globalization. Really. Oh, wait, did I talk about this? I did, right? Okay. Here we go. So, this is a church that I visited when I was in Indonesia. While I was in Indonesia, I had this great opportunity to experience a indigenous church conference. So, these 3 different church plants. They're all functioning on their own now, their own pastors, elders, and they were all meeting together. So, I'm at this church conference. I fly in. It feels like the middle of nowhere to me, right? I take a bus. Well, it's not even a bus. It's like this open bed truck. I climb in the back of this truck. We drive for like 2 hours, middle of nowhere. I cross a river in a boat, and then I walk, and then here I am. And for me, I'm like a city guy, right? This right here, right? This church right here feels like the middle of nowhere to me, okay? Okay, so that's right. Like last night, the idea that there's not light somewhere is, I'm like, again, I'm city, right? And I'm looking out from the forest, and it's just darkness. It's terrifying, okay, guys? It's a really scary place here, okay? Not used to that at all. Okay, so middle of nowhere, and I walk in, and it feels like a really traditional place. There's not, it doesn't feel like a city. So you have all these really maybe primitive buildings. This is probably the most advanced is the church that they built. It's a newer structure. But in reality, most of the houses are really, really simple. And I walk in, and there's a group of their young people from these people groups, and they're playing volleyball. And like they're wearing skinny jeans. Like they look like Americans. Well, that's because guess what? 2 hours down the road, there's an internet cafe. So you have a people group that at one point, yes, it was isolated. But the Indonesian government has seen value in building roads to these people. Like, so you've got people group that at once had very little outside contact. Now you get a road. Okay. It's only 2 hours to drive into town. And then in town, you've got an internet cafe, and you can see people and meet people, and you can watch things from America. You can do online shopping. Right? So I'm there, and guess what? Until very recently, an unreached people group. And if I didn't hear a different language being spoken, I couldn't have said that they weren't American. That's a pretty credible concept. This is a village I visited while I was in Brazil. This is, I think, 3 years ago. So Indonesia, I was there about 10 years ago. This is a village I visited in Brazil. And if I had to pick an image to represent globalization, it would probably be this image. So, again, like an 8-hour drive, I get off, and it's an island. So I cross this huge, it felt huge, like a big river to me, and I'm on an island in, like it feels like remote Brazil. Okay? And this is like a typical house in an unreached people group. Okay? So what have you got? You've got a traditional thatched roof. Very traditional. Probably the way they've been making the roof for a really, really long time. You've got mud bricks. Okay? You also have cement bricks. And then what do you have? You got a satellite. So I'm walking by this house, thatched roof, and I'm hearing like soccer highlights as I'm walking past, okay? And there's a street light for you. Yeah, and a street light above it, correct. So the way where the world is moving has in some ways made the unreached more accessible, and in some ways has also made the world more complex. It's more complicated. The worldviews you're encountering aren't so sequestered. Like there's a lot of influence coming from lots of different directions. Next, I'll talk about urbanization. So in the year 1800, 3% of people in the world lived in cities. Think that's the way it is today? By 1900, the fraction of city dwellers increased to 10%. 1900 is not very long ago. Between 1900 and 2007, it went from 10% to 50%. By 2050, it is estimated that 75 to 80% of all human beings will live in a city. Cities are where people are and where they will be in the future. So, let's go back to that. Let's go back to this, right? So I'm here talking. And the missionary I'm with, who's like doing all the translation for me, wants to introduce me to somebody. It's somebody who was in their youth group. Like they had a youth group here because we've got a church now. And he introduces me to somebody. And it's a indigenous, I guess he's a man now. He's like 19, 20. Indigenous boy, and guess where he's at? He's at university. So he grew up very remote, and now he's attending a university. And where is he living? He's living in the city. So he's like, hey, go introduce yourself. So I say hello, and he responds, guess what? In English. He doesn't speak great English, but he speaks enough to give an introduction. Not confident. He's like, doesn't quite know if he's saying the right things or whatever in English. But guys, this is where the world's going. It has become more and more complex. And so when we talk about missions being this really remote tribal thing, whatever that means, well, what we're seeing is that by 2050, 80% of all humans will probably live in a city. This is where the world is going. So, if you wanted to reach an unreached people group, you might need to live remote somewhere. And you might need to live in a big city, and you've got Starbucks around the corner. This is where the unreached are and where they're going to. I want to share a story of a friend of mine. Now, my friend who's working in Vietnam, he shared a story that perfectly illustrates the concepts that we're talking about here. Ready? Can't use the name, can't use the photo, but this is the story of one of their friends from church in Vietnam. So they're attending a Vietnamese church, and one of their friends there, this is her story about how she came to Christianity, okay? So this is Mai. She's smart, funny, she's 25, she's sharp, she's intelligent, she did great in school, did really, really good in school. And she grew up very, very poor and very, very rural, okay? She did not have a lot of opportunity. Her parents are both from different unreached people groups. She could have gone to university. So her grades are really good, and she had the opportunity to go to university, but her parents both had debts. So family first, that's her responsibility. She needs to work to help her family pay off her debt, and then maybe she'd have the opportunity to go to university. And she knows she's got essentially no opportunities in Vietnam. So I've got no opportunities here where I am. And she's heard that in the neighboring country of Malaysia, she can go and get a decently paying job and send back money. She knows no one in Malaysia. But she gets in a vehicle, and she takes a bus. She travels and lives there and works and sends money back to her family. She meets a Christian in Malaysia. Is taken to a church. Thinks it's all very, very weird, right? She talks about her first time being in a Christian church is like so different, right, than anything she's ever experienced. And she becomes a believer over the years, living in Malaysia, working, becomes a believer. Eventually, she moves back to Vietnam, but you know what? She doesn't move back to her hometown. Where does she move to? She moves to the city. In her mind, what life, what opportunities are there for me back in my hometown? So she moves to the city. There, she gets a good-paying job, and she moves to, I can't say the city name. She moves to one of the largest cities in Vietnam and starts attending church there and meets my friends who are there to help bring the gospel to an unreached people group. You know what's really interesting? She doesn't speak the indigenous languages of her parents. They speak Vietnamese in the home. So she's got parents from two different unreached people groups they both have their own heart languages, but she doesn't speak it, even though she grew up with them. In fact, she can't communicate with her grandma because her grandma only speaks the indigenous language. Do you see how the world is changing? The world is changing so rapidly, we are just barely keeping up. So did you hear all the elements of globalization and urbanization in my story? She grew up in a village, but moved to a city. She's not rich, but has actually traveled internationally. She has a strong ethnic identity, but doesn't speak the languages of her parents. So when we think about missions, we think about missionaries, we think about places like this, but we also should think about places like this. We should think about places and people like this, and we should think about people like this, and people like this, and people like this, and this, and this. So, how is the world changing? Man, it is changing incredibly quickly. Very, very, very fast. And what's it going to take? So, let's see. How much time do we have? What I wanted to do, we'll see, it's into 45, like 10 minutes. What I wanted to do was to have you plan a church with me. I'm trying to see. Does anybody have any questions about anything I've talked about so far? Any questions at all? Yeah.
So in a city when 90% of the people have access to internet, I'm confused how they're unreached when they actually can access the gospel or something religious.
That is a really, really good question. So, when we think about the unreached, I think we talk a lot about access, right? So now, if you got a person who speaks a little bit of a language and they've got internet, they can Google search something about Christianity and maybe find something that they could potentially comprehend. So in the missiological world, we started to talk about people groups that we talk about percentages of people in a people group that are believing the gospel now. So access is a tricky thing. It used to be access was really easily defined, right? So it's really, really easy to say this person does or doesn't have access to the gospel. And now it's a lot easier for us to talk about believers in a people group rather than what they do or do not have access to. The reality is, and there are, I'm sure, internet ministries. But we found in the realms of reaching the world still takes the same things. That it is still very unlikely for somebody to stumble upon something about Christianity and place their faith in the Lord. And then what happens? Somebody becomes a believer, and there's no Christian community for them there. So the issue of church planning is still the same, like I believe, because even if you got somebody who stumbles upon something about Jesus online, even though they're not looking for it, what do they even know what to look for? Stumble upon something about Jesus, there's still the need for them to be a part of a Christian community, and the greater need for their people group to be reached. So to be given the access and resources and personnel to evangelize their entire people group. Again, the question you're asking is such a great microcosm of the bigger thing, which is the world has become more complex. It is more interconnected now than ever, but the mission field that we're working in has become more complex than ever as well. I'm not sure that helps answer your question at all, but yeah.
So in your explanation of globalization,
Yeah.
you started with a list of things, and what really stuck out to me was that the not ideal things are first on the list.
Yeah.
Drugs, crime, sex, etc.
Yep.
How did you prepare yourselves to spread information faster than the beginning of that list?
Oh, man. We have a whole bunch of other missionaries in this room from Ethnos Canada. They would love to answer that question for you. Man, so let me talk about, I can talk about this from a missionary standpoint. The question is almost a parental question for me. So I've got 3 kids. Finn is 6. It is hard for me to even foresee the world that Finn will encounter when he's goes off to college. So again, the world isn't slowing down, it is speeding up. All this change I'm talking about, okay? So what my role as a parent is right now, and I think it's the same as a missionary. So my role as a parent right now is to use wisdom to see the pattern and to try and prepare Finn through conversation, through teaching, through relationship for the life ahead, for the changed world ahead of him. I think the biggest thing for me and Finn right now would be that he's seeing, and this is the hard part. For me, the hardest part is Finn has to see a level of Christianity modeled by Deborah and I that cements its truth in his mind. So we talk about, strategies, we talk about all of those things. We talk about, access, internet, and but it still has to all fundamentally be about relationships. So even if someone is converted by something they can read online, the job isn't done yet. Because what does Jesus ask us to do? Jesus has asked us to make disciples, not just to make converts. So guess what? A relationship still has to happen with this person. Someone needs to come alongside them and help them grow into maturity, to be a disciple. Oh man, I don't know. It's just such a hard question to answer because I'm wrestling through it all right now as a parent. How do we prepare my kids for the changing world ahead? How am I speaking to them before the world is speaking to them? I don't know. That was a great 5-minute non-answer. Yeah. 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 Oh yeah, absolutely. That's really good. Yeah.
One thing that's just come to my mind, and it's drawn from what we're doing in our family growth groups on Thursday, but raising kids God's way, is that God's standard doesn't change. So even though, yeah, this changes, and maybe we're not necessarily reaching out to such primitive tribal groups, the standard's always been the same.
Oh yeah.
And just how much we could rest on that, because we're also trying to figure out how to raise our kids in this world that's changing all the time. And it's that's the only constant that has ever been is that God's not changed.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
That's what gives me hope. And also thinking, in the past we've had missionaries come and they've expressed how, going out to the mission field, their hesitancy, moving out to these tribal groups.
Mm-hmm.
Where me in the background, yeah, get my sleeping bag. I got the North Star. I'd be good to do that. But if you ask me to move for that, not a chance.
It's funny. So usually the opposite when I'm talking to people. Oh, the city, no problem. I got running water. I got electricity. Sweet. But that tribal stuff, heck no. Rural Ontario for you. Oh yeah, yeah. I totally know what you mean. And I think it's an encouraging thing. Is we talk about, man, everything is changing so fast. As far as a practical sense, what am I trying to do with Finn, Saoirse, and Lula? Right? I am trying to to be teaching them now that you want them to be aware of where the world is at, but I'm also very cautious about them, like, again, this isn't a parental judgment to anybody else, but I'm not giving Finn my phone to just scroll YouTube. Like, so he's like encountering tons of different messages that may or probably don't reflect any of our values, right? So I think part of it is just practical, where sometimes we give our kids like unfettered access to the internet, and go, where are they hearing these things from? Well, that's because you can, like I said, globalization, the past information isn't like special anymore. Information isn't it's just there. Everybody has the same information. We kind of feel that way. So the information that's available to Finn, just if I'm unguarded with how they're utilizing an internet and everything, yeah.
What you were saying, Esther, about how pretty much anybody with a phone can open it up and find the gospel, and maybe even in a language that's close to theirs. Something that I've been thinking about a little. Everything I could possibly need to know about mechanical engineering, I could access. But I'm probably not going to become a mechanical engineer. Or anything I could, learning how to play the piano, or becoming a five-star chef. It's all there. The gospel's there. So it's prioritizing, and I think teaching or showing just the importance of eternity. Because I think sometimes that can grab someone. What I do today and tomorrow, and what I learn, and do I go to university, and do I become a doctor, or a lawyer, or an engineer, or a musician, or a chef. Just the importance of my eternal soul, because then maybe I'll change the direction of what I am seeking.
Yeah, I think that's a really good thought. Like I said, it's just still really complex, right? All right, well, it's 45. We're done. If you have any more questions, again, like the great thing for you guys, I'm used to talking to churches or individuals that don't have a lot of good resources. Like Ethnos Canada is a 30-minute drive away, and probably the missionaries sitting here with you guys from Ethnos Canada are probably more qualified to talk about these things than I am. So if you have questions, like feel free to grab anybody here and continue the conversation. But you get the main point of this, what I want to communicate is just, again, the complexity of the mission field that we're encountering today. So you've got not just a people group that is completely isolated of themselves, but you've got areas in these global communities where 5 or 6 different unreached people groups sometimes are inhabiting a large area and intermixing and talking to one another, So again, just the reality of, when we talk about missions, is just we've gotten really complex over the last 20 years, 30 years. All right, that's it, and go ahead.
Just want to say some great questions here. I'd love to, missions committee, love to take an evening or whatever sometime to unpack some of these. You did a good job. You got a few minutes, and there were some excellent questions.
Oh, yeah.
We'll take more time on that sometime.
All right, sounds good. Okay, break. I'm not sure how to close that out.